Hi, I'm Mark Madison, historian at the National Conservation Training Center, and I'd like to welcome you to Wolves, Condors, and Trout, a new effort to save imperiled species. And today we're going to have Mike Phillips, who's Executive Director with the Turner Endangered Species Fund, who actually got his start working with Fish and Wildlife Service early on, working with our red wolf recovery project. And before we have an interview with Mike Phillips, where we hope you'll call in with some questions, I thought we'd show a little film clip that was done here at NCTC, kind of explaining red wolf recovery. And I think we'll go to that film clip for just a few minutes and then talk with Mike.
Well, that's us. That's us.
Well, Mike, welcome to NCTC. We're really glad you could make it out here. And we were just showing, as you saw, some red wolf footage. And my understanding is that's one of the first recovery projects you worked on for the Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yeah.
How'd you get involved in that?
Well, I had worked with gray wolves in Minnesota with Dave Meach and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service many years ago, and had done wolf work in Alaska as well. And one thing inevitably led to another, and I learned of the service's effort, at that time a hoped-for effort in the mid-1980s to restore red wolves to the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge, and I was lucky enough to be the one selected to be responsible for the daily grind, and it was a treat. And I still consider myself a refuge biologist and working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, even though I'm not.
Right.
And I think the world of the agency, I can't imagine a better mission than the mission of the Fish and Wildlife Service. Now, I don't always agree with what you're doing at this point.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
And this evening I'll have some things to say about the service's vision for wolf recovery in the West, which I think is inadequate. But nonetheless, I still consider that I wear a brown uniform.
Perfect. Let's talk a little about the red wolf recovery. I mean, you'd studied gray wolves, you said, in Minnesota beforehand, and Alaska also, was it? Or,
yeah.
Was it difficult going from gray wolves to red wolves, or did you find them very similar?
No, many of the issues were the same. Rareness, whether it's too few ferrets or too few wolves, are very much involve the same issues. Actually, the red wolf program gave me an experience base that few wolf biologists have. Most wolf biologists have worked with naturally occurring populations. Very few have worked also with reintroduced populations, especially reintroduced populations that were spawned by captive stock, by animals born and raised in captivity that the service has subsequently released. So it gave me a keen appreciation for the challenges of reintroduction, which are fundamentally different than the challenges of ensuring coexistence between people and a naturally occurring population. So I think I'm well-rounded and getting rounder as the years go by. But so it was different, but much the same.
What's harder? Is it actually reintroducing a captively bred species more difficult, or getting the folks to coexist with the species?
Well, gee whiz, the coexistence part is the difficult. I thought you were going to ask, is it easiest to reintroduce or to reestablish a population by reintroducing wild stock or reintroducing captive stock? And clearly the answer there is wild stock is much better suited for life in the wild than captive stock. Although, at least with wolves, we know that captive stock is plenty good enough.
Yeah.
Now, what's most difficult, restoring a population or ensuring that it persists for an extended period through coexistence with people? Clearly the coexistence part. Wolves are one of the weediest species we've got. They're very good at what they do. They don't need a whole lot of help. They need to be left alone, and they need to be left alone, and that's hard for people to do. You know, Mark, what has amazed me is that we've got a critter in the form of the wolf that was once spread throughout this country, one of the great ecological generalists, and has no specific habitat needs, doesn't represent a threat to human safety in any real way, and yet we can't recover this thing. It should be one of the easiest species to work with in many ways, and yet it really is the litmus test for difficulty. And partly what I'll say this evening, and why I'm disappointed in the service's vision for wolf recovery in the West, is that they're lowering the bar of acceptance because gray wolves are so difficult politically and socially. The service, I think, is accepting far less of themselves than they should. You know, the Endangered Species Act doesn't say you shall work on this until it becomes difficult and then you can stop.
Right.
It says y'all shall go forth. And I think that we've missed the mark in the West. I spoke with Marshall Jones and Gary Fraser today in Washington and made that point that that the service needs to do a bit more. We've done well, but we're not done.
Did you find there were fewer of those problems in the east with the red wolf because they were largely isolated at Alligator River than there is in the west, where there's ranches and so on abutting some of these parks? And
yeah, you know, it was easier.
lands?
It was easier in the east than it has been in the west. Not because the wolves were isolated. Quite the contrary. That eastern landscape that we just saw, the North Carolina program, for example, is very much defined by private land.
Okay.
So there's keen potential for wolves and citizens to interact. But red wolves, by their very nature, and the fact that there's not a big livestock industry in northeastern North Carolina, for example, and the fact that people didn't have a contemporary history with the species, made coexistence much easier. In the western U.S., there are still all of the old concerns that wolves will mean the end to the livestock industry, that wolves will mean the end to the outfitting industry. And the fact is that isn't true. Neither concerns are validated by the data. You can have wolves in livestock. You can have wolves in big game hunting. Wolf recovery has never been an either-or proposition, and if it is, we're a most unimaginative people. That we can't think our way out of this problem is unacceptable, because the answers are really quite simple. And in the western U.S., the answer lies mostly in public land. Fortunately, we had the sense to set aside big tracts of land. Yellowstone National Park, Bob Marshall Wilderness, the Blue Range Wolf Recovery Area where Mexican wolves are currently being reintroduced. Public land is the last great place for gray wolves. Fortunately, there are millions and millions and millions of acres of public land in the West that support robust populations of native ungulates, and gray wolves will do quite well. It's the public lands of the West that should be our beachhead for wolf recovery. Maybe there'll be some private lands that fit the equation of recovery as well, but mostly not. Private lands are not an especially good place to be a gray wolf. So it was harder in the West because of the old fears. But the service has good answers to all of the questions. They just have to shore up.
I know we do.
Just to shore up.
But it reminds me of the Aldo Leopold quote, which he must have said in the 40s. You know, it's wildlife management, it's comparatively easy. It's human management that's difficult,
Indeed.
and that is one of our challenges.
Right.
Let's segue to the Yellowstone wolf reintroduction, the subject of a very good book. As you mentioned, it's a picture book, but there's a really nice book, The Wolves of Yellowstone, actually one of the most informative ones I've read, because there's a couple different perspectives in here, and it actually gives a historical context. But this seems like a success project. I mean, a success story. I mean, the wolves are there and thriving. How did you overcome some of the prejudices in Yellowstone to make that reintroduction work?
Well, what was critical to the restoration of gray wolves to Yellowstone, the Department of Interior, in the form of the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, had a keen institutional commitment to recovery. Interior was simply not going to allow it to fail. And it was first discussed in 1944 by Dr. Leopold. It came up again in the early 1970s. The then Assistant Secretary of Interior, Nathaniel Reed, convened a meeting in the park in 1972. The idea percolated for 20 more years. And then with Secretary Babbitt in place, Director Beatty, they put it over the top because they simply refused to accept anything other than a complete assemblage of the faunal record of Yellowstone Park. Now, it's great wolf habitat, and so once you got the green light, the mechanics of restoration were really quite simple. And by 1996, early 1997, the restoration project was largely over. We had successfully restored the species to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. That then began the challenging phase, which will always be involved with, and that's the phase of coexistence. But it was because the restoration project was largely over that I saw it was possible to leave the Department of Interior and strike off on a new venture, which we'll speak about this evening as well. And that was a very difficult decision for me. I had worked for the Department of Interior for many years, mostly with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and more recently with Yellowstone National Park, heading up the wolf reintroduction program. And I felt very comfortable with Interior. I never questioned Interior's mission. It always made great sense to me. So it was difficult to leave. And so now I'm here to cause trouble, trying to get
the advantage when
Interior
you leave.
to continue to do great stuff. I mean, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is a very important partner to the Turner Endangered Species Fund,
Sure.
and I have nothing but good things to say about the service.
Sounds like you have a few not so good things to suggest about us.
Any team that puts forth as many ideas as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to recognize that some ideas aren't going to be the best, and of course the service has to compete different, or has to compare and address competing interests. One of the things that I noticed as I work with state agencies, they really only have to, for example, listen to the local voice. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks only has to listen to Montanans for the most part. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to listen to the local voice and the national voice. Yes. And quite often those two voices say very different things. And that's a big challenge.
That is the challenge.
So anyway, Yellowstone was a great experience. It was a super project.
Let me ask you a question. You said one of the things you had to determine early on was the mechanics of restoration. What are the mechanics? I mean, are there lessons learned in Yellowstone that could be applied to other reintroductions? I mean, what are the stages that?
Well, we know clearly from the work in the Northern Rockies the way it was designed, and this is the credit for this is due to Dr. Stephen Fritz, who works for the service now in the Denver office in federal aid. Steve recognized the value of conducting a particular type of reintroduction in central Idaho and a different reintroduction in the Yellowstone area to advance the science of recovery. And from those two studies, we know quite clearly that acclimation, putting gray wolves in a pen for a period of time and releasing them directly from that pen, has the effect of attenuating their tendency to home. Gray wolves, like most mammals, have a very keen homing ability. And we expected that the animals are going to want to go back to Canada. And indeed, that's what the animals in Idaho tried to do. In contrast, the wolves we released in Yellowstone exhibited very restricted movements after being released. And the only thing that really makes sense is that the acclimation period had the effect of attenuating that tendency. We know that. We also know that gray wolves are more hardwired to breed than we expected. For example, all of the females that were brought down from Canada, at least those that were of reproductive age, weren't so terribly troubled by captivity that they didn't cycle. And the reason that Yellowstone came out of the chute like gangbusters, and we had reproduction that very first year, is that the females were comfortable enough in captivity that they went ahead and experienced their estrus cycle. They bred in captivity, sometimes with males they hadn't met prior to being in Yellowstone. And that proved to be a great jump start to the reintroduction project. So we know now that gray wolves are a bit more robust than we had previously imagined. And then there's some other things that we learned as well about public relations and that should have application to other wolf efforts and other efforts to restore other imperiled species.
Are there any species that are even more difficult to reintroduce than wolves as regards public relations? I'm thinking grizzlies perhaps, or because you were involved with grizzly studies also.
Yeah, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service knows that we stand ready to assist with the reintroduction of grizzly bears to central Idaho if the current administration decides to actually affect the final the final decision that appeared in the record of decision.
How do you convince people not to be afraid of wolves or grizzlies or large mammalian predators? I mean, how does that ever occur? Do you have to wait generations, or how does one enact that?
You know, with gray wolves, the issue has never, the deal breaker with gray wolves hasn't been human safety. Although people inevitably discuss it, it hasn't been the problem that you might think. With wolves, the issue really is livestock and big game. And the issue really is livestock. With grizzly bears, there was concern in central Idaho about the threat to human safety.
Sure.
I think that that concern was most recently voiced by the governor of Idaho in not so diplomatic terms. And it is a concern. But the fact of the matter is, there's far greater threats to human safety that we encounter every day than being mauled by a grizzly bear in the wilds of central Idaho. And our public lands should be, in some cases, wild places and challenge us in new and exciting ways. And I don't wish for someone to be mauled by a grizzly bear, but having studied grizzlies in Alaska, having thought about reintroduction of large carnivores, that should not be a deal breaker. There's a way to balance that. Certainly you can provide from a legal perspective a provision that allows an individual to kill a grizzly bear or a gray wolf if they feel like their life is threatened. So there are ways to deal with it, and it was a concern, but Chris Servine, the grizzly bear recovery coordinator for the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, was able to build a strong case for the reintroduction of grizzly bears to central Idaho. I believe the preferred alternative that appeared in the final environmental impact statement called for the reintroduction of bears to central Idaho, and that was the decision made by the previous administration. I believe the current administration is revisiting that issue, and I hope that they decide to reintroduce. In the meantime, we have said, the Turner Endangered Species Fund has said to Dr. Servine, we stand ready to help, and we're now looking to build a program that would have us assist him with the daily grind of his work in the cabinet yak ecosystem of northwestern Montana to advance grizzly bear recovery that way.
Well, let's talk about your new job with the Turner Endangered Species Fund. You're executive director of that fund, and Turner lands make up, what, 1.8 million acres? Is that?
Yeah, Mr. Turner owns about 1.8 million acres, and we do work a lot on Mr. Turner's lands. But our mission does not restrict us to Turner properties. We can work wherever our board approves us to work. We could work on snow leopards in Nepal if that's what the board wanted us to do. The fund's mission is really quite simple. We exist to conserve biological diversity by ensuring the persistence of imperiled species and their habitats with an emphasis on private land. We focus on large carnivores, grasslands, pollinators, species with historic ranges that include properties owned by Mr. Turner, and finally dissemination of credible scientific and policy information about biodiversity conservation. Mostly we say to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, how can we help? If it's important to the service, it's important to us. If it's important to a state agency, it's important to us. Now, we can't act on all of those things that are important to us, but our agenda is your agenda. Our agenda is the state's agendas.
Would you give us some examples of some of the things you partnered with Fish and Wildlife Service on?
We've got a very active reintroduction program involving red-cockaded woodpeckers in northern Florida. That's a close collaborative effort with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. In South Dakota, we'll be reintroducing swift fox very soon. We're working on behalf of prairie dog conservation in South Dakota and New Mexico. We have a proposal before the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service now to put the touches on a black-footed ferret reintroduction into northern New Mexico, if that can be built. We're working on behalf of gray wolf recovery in the northern Rockies, Mexican wolf recovery in the southwest. We have a Mexican wolf captive breeding facility at the Ladder Ranch, right on the eastern edge of the Mexican wolf, Blue Range wolf recovery area. We have a black-footed ferret breeding facility at Vermejo Park Ranch. We're working to put the final touches on a hoped-for reintroduction of California condors to New Mexico, a hope-for reintroduction of oplemental falcons in New Mexico. With state agencies, we're working on behalf of freshwater trout, principally West Slope cutthroat trout and Rio Grande cutthroat trout. We've got a major effort underway with New Mexico Department of Game and Fish to restore desert bighorn sheep. We have efforts underway to restore about 1,000 acres of wetland habitat at the interface between the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico and the Armendaris Ranch. That largely involves the eradication of salt cedar and the restoration of the natural hydrology of the setting. The refuge has done a lot of great work in this regard, and they're instructing us as well. So many things going on, some of which connect to landscapes specific to Mr. Turner's properties, like the wetlands work at the Armendaris and Bosque del Apache Refuge. Others connect to big landscapes. Gray wolf recovery in the southern Rockies, for example, will connect to western Colorado and northern New Mexico. And Mr. Turner has a property in that setting, but it's a landscape that covers millions and millions and millions of acres.
How have you noticed different challenges in working on private lands versus public lands where your experience had been before? Or are they largely the same?
I haven't experienced any insurmountable obstacles to working on private land. Now, I work for a landowner who is most open-minded and most desirous of having imperiled species present and making his properties be a beachhead for conservation of native species. Moreover, I have found the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and state agencies to be most cooperative in helping me maximize the goodness that arises from Mr. Turner's willingness. And Ted is nothing if not willing. So I haven't encountered the challenges myself that some people speak to. Some people would have you believe that the Endangered Species Act, for example, places an unacceptable burden on private landowners. Hasn't been my experience. Some would have you believe that the act is an unwieldy piece of legislation that puts upon people unfairly, and that the service is rigid in its application. Hasn't been my experience. Quite the contrary. The difference that I've noticed, public versus private land, is that there really is no private land big enough to affect a serious, large-scale conservation program. That one of the largest tracts of private land in the country is Vermejo Park Ranch, owned by Mr. Turner in northern New Mexico, at nearly 600,000 acres. That's nearly 1,000 square miles of deeded land. And yet it's not big enough for gray wolf recovery. It's not big enough for grizzly bear recovery. The only way that these large carnivore programs, for example, can be effected successfully is to connect to a big public landscape. And that's Forest Service lands, BLM lands, National Park Service lands, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service National Wildlife Refuges. Public lands provide us the landscape that's big enough to begin to think big. Private lands force a pretty narrow vision unless you can connect those private lands to public
corridors
lands.
or some such thing.
Correct.
One thing that struck me in reading the book and reading a couple articles about you is there's some interesting things happening on the private lands that you're involved with. And one of them was with bison, a species that was incredibly imperiled at the turn of the century, a significant number coming back, many on Mr. Turner's lands, but also having economic potential with them. Do you want to speak to that?
Well, Mr. Turner is determined to ranch bison. He is the largest bison producer in the country, has about probably 25,000 head. He expects his herd to grow, so he's looking for more grass ranches. You can't have a successful bison operation without a lot of grass.
Right.
But he's not restoring the bison. The bison that he owns are ranched. They are a commodity. It is a for-profit, serious ranching endeavor. There are fences. The bison can only go so far. Turner Enterprises is the company that's responsible for the bison ranching operation. And they work against several basic observations. One observation is that good fences make good neighbors. And so they do have fences that keep this very strong athletic animal inside in the form of bison. But what the bison ranching operation has done is provide all of us, through Mr. Turner's willingness, access to great study areas to affect the conservation of imperiled native species. If, for example, we have serious efforts underway on behalf of black-tailed prairie dogs. That leads logically to black-footed ferrets. It leads logically to swift fox. We believe that when you look at the grasslands of this country, historically the big driver, that animal that made the system click was bison. Bison and fire drove the system. And depending on the pattern of bison and fire, other species would either flourish or not. And so we're looking very hard to use bison as a big driver of biodiversity conservation, recognizing that while the bison can't go forever afield, maybe the swift fox that we introduced at South Dakota, or at the Bad River Ranch in South Dakota, can go far afield. The Swift Fox Project, for example, has connected itself to the Lower Brule Tribes reservation lands, the Fort Pierre National Grasslands. The U.S. Forest Service is participating. The National Park Service, Badlands National Park, for example, they've expressed interest in joining this big team to try to restore swift fox to western South Dakota. Now, swift fox aren't listed federally, but they are listed by the state of South Dakota. Trends don't look good. I would guess 5-10 years out, you could revisit the issue of swift fox listing under the Endangered Species Act and find that it has merit. So all of these things begin to support projects that hopefully will mean that the Endangered Species Act and its wonderful powers don't have to be invoked. And it's because Mr. Turner is a keen supporter of bison that leads us to all of these other wonderful conservation opportunities that root themselves to the great grasslands.
Were you suggesting, though, that bison are a keystone species?
No,
I mean, can you? So,
no
do you need to have the bison to bring back the swift fox and the?
No, well, in some
prairie dogs?
cases, cattle, which technically are an exotic species introduced from Europe.
Sure.
It depends on when you define what is exotic and what is native. Cattle were brought into this country in the 1800s. As we got rid of the bison, we brought in cattle from Europe. But cattle can do much the same. Prairie dogs, for example, don't do well in settings where the grass grows. And in some settings where it's typical classic short grass prairie, even in the presence of average rain, the grasses don't grow, and prairie dogs do very, very well. In other settings, much of the prairie dog's historic range was defined by mixed grass prairies, where in the presence of rain, the grasses really grow. So absent fire or grazing, the grasses grow, the prairie dogs are choked out. So bison, through their grazing and trampling activities, would have made a setting more suitable for prairie dogs than not. And you can go on, but it seems to us that bison were probably one of the great drivers of the complexion of the grasslands historically. They occurred in such robust numbers, and their effect is so very obvious.
Yeah.
Trampling and wallowing and grazing, defecating and urinating, the placement of nutrients back into the system. They had a big time effect on the grasslands, no doubt about it.
The other thing you mentioned is another place where I think of some of your work as being innovative is fire regimes and so on. It's been a big issue with the fund and the Turner lands. Do you want to talk a little about?
Well, we recognize that fire can be a very effective management tool. We recognize that it's part of an important part of many settings. Fire is used to promote the restoration of longleaf pine. We use fire to promote the restoration of longleaf pine in northern Florida. That's a system that's largely driven by fire. Absent fire, the hardwood understory grows up and begins to choke out much of the life of that setting. Longleaf pine historically was a wonderful beachhead for red-cockaded woodpeckers, for example. But in the presence of a robust understory of hardwoods, red-cockaded woodpeckers don't do well. So fire is a tool that we can use to keep that setting as it should be, if what it was is what it should be. Fire is used in the western properties as well to try to restore some of the natural processes that would have defined places like Vermejo Park Ranch. Vermejo will burn tens of thousands of acres a year to try to restore the old growth characteristics of that ponderosa pine forest. Now that may mean benefits for northern goshawks. Ultimately, if Vermejo's forest is managed this way long enough, it will generate material benefits for northern spotted owls, or Mexican spotted owls, I should say. So we certainly don't shy away from fire, and we recognize that it's an appropriate tool. Not only in the southeast, but the grasslands will probably use fire at Bad River Ranch, and also in the forested lands of the western U.S. where Mr. Turner owns property.
You mentioned some of the other projects you're doing with the Turner Endangered Species ones. One of the more interesting one was aversion with gray wolves. Why don't you tell us a little about that project? It's been one of the more controversial ones, but it's one of the things that's interesting and innovative you can do.
Sure. Well, and actually the story behind our efforts to aversively condition gray wolves as a means to reduce depredations on livestock. The story is not what most people think. We never believed that aversive conditioning would be a tool that could be used over a large landscape to promote wolf recovery. It's asking a wolf a lot to change its predatory habits in some pronounced way. But we recognized it had never been properly researched. So we said that we would attempt to conduct an experiment to see if there was some practicality in aversive conditioning. More importantly, it gave us an obvious way to say to Ed Bangs, who's the recovery coordinator for the Northern Rocky Mountain Gray Wolf for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Ed, we're here, put us to work. We've got a great team, we've got some resources, put us to work. And part of that was to build this pen on the Flying D Ranch so we could conduct these trials. But more importantly, what it did was give Ed a chance to do something with animals that had gotten into trouble that he wouldn't have been able to have done otherwise. Some of the animals, for example, that made their way to the Flying D because they'd gotten into trouble elsewhere, Ed would probably have to have exercised lethal control otherwise. So we put him in the pen in the Flying D, and ultimately through our husbandry of those animals. They were maintained in good health. Ed was able to justify a re-release of those animals, whether they had been conditioned or not. And the re-releases led to some animals surviving that wouldn't have. Some of those animals produced puppies that wouldn't have been produced otherwise. So the net effect of all of that work, spinning around aversive conditioning, was to move wolf recovery forward. It put more wolves on the landscape than would have been there otherwise. It is, however, aversive conditioning is not the heart and soul of our wolf work with Ed in the Northern Rockies. The heart and soul of our wolf work in the Northern Rockies is being out, collecting good information on what gray wolves are doing, working with local folks on a daily basis, assisting Ed with the daily grind, based on an observation, a belief that we hold very firmly. And that is, for gray wolves, good information provided to good people leads to good decisions. If you give people good information and good decisions are made, you will advance coexistence. And that's the heart and soul of our wolf work. The fancy techno-based gizmo known as aversive conditioning was just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle.
It kind of got blown out of proportion.
Well, it reads well in the paper, right? Newspapers are in the business of selling newspapers. So sure, they're going to make a big deal out of electronic shock collars and POW camp and aversive conditioning. It's not so interesting for them to write about the real story, and that is, how does a private organization like the Turner Endangered Species Fund saddle up with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service so that on a daily basis coexistence is more possible than not? That's not real glamorous, but that's the real heart and soul of endangered species recovery. It's the daily grind. And heretofore, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has largely been left to their own devices, or a state agency. But the Turner Endangered Species Fund is the first private organization to ever say to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we want to go out with you on a daily basis, drink coffee with ranchers, listen to their frustration, work hard to figure out ways to provide good people with good information so good decisions can be made. That's tough work, and it's not glamorous.
I think it's easier to get their attention, speaking as private landowners to private landowners. Is there something there?
Oh, maybe, although Mr. Turner is not a typical
rancher,
landowner, and they know that. Now, he's a super owner and a most responsible owner and a wonderful boss that is the real deal. His commitment never wavers, but he's not a typical landowner, and they know that.
They know that.
And they look at us a bit oddly at times, and we have to earn their respect and show them that our work is credible. And in part, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is due a world of credit for giving us a chance to show the service and others that we can make a difference. It was amazing to me, having worked for Interior for such a long while, and all of these people were friends of mine. Marshall Jones, for example, your deputy director, we go way back to Atlanta days. That Red Wolf tape, gee, was that mid-1980s. As soon as I took off the uniform and went into the private sector, it was as though no one knew who I was. And had I been in their shoes, I probably would have thought the same, because the Turner Endangered Species Fund was an unknown commodity. But guys like Ed Bangs, Ralph Costa, Dave Parsons, Brian Kelly, Mike Lockhart, your recovery coordinators for Mexican wolves, gray wolves, red-cockaded woodpeckers, black-footed ferrets, gave us a chance. And now most of our work is right shoulder to shoulder with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service every day, trying to make a difference.
Mike, that's a great way for us to go out. And to segue, I think we'll take.
I saw the sign that said we were about done.
Well, the last 10 minutes, what I'd like to do is run the rest of the Red Wolf tape that we started with. And I'd like to thank all of you in the audience for tuning in to hear Mike Phillips. And I'd really like to thank Mike for making time out of your very, very busy schedule.
My pleasure.
To come out here and speak this evening at NCTC. And thank you very much.
You bet.
And we'll go out with the Red Wolf Recovery Project.
I'll sit and watch.
You'll see yourself in it again.